Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we journey back across the vast, shimmering stretches of time, leaving the modern world behind to visit a place of sun-drenched marble and shadow-draped vines. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening from. Find your most comfortable position. Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders and settle in. Let us begin. In the beginning, before the world knew the name of Rome or the weight of its empires, there was only the land. The Bay of Naples was not yet a place of harbors and villas, but a cradle of fire and sea. And at the heart of this cradle stood Vesuvius. In the year 79 AD, those who lived in its shadow did not call it a volcano. That word, a descriptor of fire and earth-shattering power, did not yet exist in their tongue. To them, Vesuvius was simply a mountain vast, unshaking, and seemingly eternal. It was a giant, clothed in emerald green, its slopes heavy with the weight of vineyards and olive groves. It was not a threat, nor a warning, nor even a mystery. It simply was. To understand the tragedy of the last days, one must first understand the peace that preceded it. This peace was not the absence of noise, but the presence of life. Imagine the air of the Campanian coast. It was not the thin, cold air of the high peaks, but a thick, sweet atmosphere, heavy with the scent of sea salt and ripening fruit. The soil of the mountain was not like ordinary earth. It was dark, crumbly, and unnaturally fertile, the forgotten gift of eruptions, so ancient they had passed out of memory and into the realm of myth. The farmers who worked these slopes did not know they were tilling the ash of their ancestors. They only knew that the grapes grew larger here, the wine flowed sweeter, and the sun seemed to linger just a little longer on the terraced hills. Vesuvius was a silent guardian. For centuries, it had watched the rise of the Samnites, the Greeks, and finally the Romans. It had seen the small fishing villages grow into sprawling seaside retreats. It saw the construction of the great port at Misenum and the rise of the villas at Oplantis. It was a backdrop to the mundane and the magnificent alike. But beneath this mask of green and quiet, the earth was not at rest. Deep within the belly of the mountain, miles beneath the roots of the ancient oaks, the elemental forces were stirring. This was not the kind of stirring that the modern world measures with needles and screens. It was a slow, patient buildup of pressure, a yawning tension that had been accumulating for 800 years. For 8 centuries, the throat of the mountain had been sealed by a plug of solid rock, a stopper of stone that refused to yield. The fire within was not gone, it was merely waiting. It was like the chaos we spoke of before, force older than language, indifferent to the lives of the men and women who built their homes upon its skin. While the citizens of Pompeii argued in the Forum, bathed in the great Thermae, and painted their walls with scenes of gods and heroes, the mountain was holding its breath. To the people of Pompeii, the earth was a solid thing, a foundation that could be trusted. They were a people of stone and mortar, of law and commerce. They looked at the mountain and saw profit. They saw the wealth of the vineyards and the prestige of the view. They did not see the furnace. They did not know that the very fertility that made them rich was the calling card of a killer. In the gardens of the wealthy, fountains spilled water into marble basins, the sound a soft, rhythmic patter that mimicked the heartbeat of a world at peace. The streets were paved with dark basalt, stone pulled from the mountain's old flows, worn smooth by the sandals of 1,000 generations. There was a deep, collective amnesia that hung over the bay. There had been signs, of course, 17 years before the end, a massive earthquake had torn through the region, toppling statues and cracking the very foundations of the city. Temples had crumbled, and the great water pipes had burst. But the Romans were a resilient people, a people of pride and reconstruction. They saw the earthquake not as a warning from the mountain, but as a test of their resolve. They rebuilt the temples with even finer marble. They patched the walls. They moved back into their villas, confident that the earth had finished its tantrum. They did not realize that the earthquake was merely a symptom of the mountain's awakening, precursor to the moment the internal pressure would finally overcome the weight of the sky. As the years passed between the great earthquake and the final summer, the mountain remained deceptively still. The vines continued to climb. The birds continued to nest in the high crags, but the wells began to act strangely. The water, once cold and clear, would sometimes turn brackish or vanish entirely, retreating back into the earth as if the mountain were drinking it down. The dogs would howl at the empty air, their sensitive ears picking up the low-frequency groans of shifting plates that no human could detect. In these final years, the atmosphere of Pompeii was one of decadent, sun-soaked normalcy. It was a city of 50,000 souls, a place where the smells of the garum factories mixed with the perfume of the wealthy. Imagine walking through the streets in the golden hour of the afternoon. The heat of the day is beginning to soften, the stones beneath your feet still warm from the Mediterranean sun. You hear the calls of the street vendors, the clatter of chariot wheels against the curb, the distant laughter from a nearby tavern. This was a world of vivid color, the deep reds of the frescoed walls, the bright blues of the mosaic floors, the shimmering gold of the jewelry worn by the elite. It was a world that felt permanent. It did not feel like a world on the brink of erasure. And yet, the mountain was always there, framing every view, a silent presence in every conversation. It was the master of the horizon. When the sun set behind the peaks, casting a long, cool shadow over the city, it was as if the mountain were reaching out to touch the homes of those who lived within its reach. It was a touch that would soon turn from a shadow into a shroud. As the summer of 79 AD reached its height, the heat became oppressive. The air grew still, and the cicadas buzzed with a frantic, metallic intensity. The mountain, usually vibrant and green, began to look different in the harsh light of August. The springs that fed the city's fountains grew sluggish. The very ground seemed to vibrate with a subtle, rhythmic hum, a sound so low it was felt in the bones rather than heard in the ears. It was the sound of the earth preparing to speak. But for now, the city remains. The bread is in the ovens. The wine is in the jars. The children are playing in the courtyards, their voices echoing off the painted walls. The mountain stands tall, a silent witness to a civilization that believes it has conquered nature. We will linger here in this final moment of peace before the sky turns to stone and the light is swallowed by the dark. For the story of Pompeii is not just a story of death, but a story of the terrible beauty of the earth's awakening. Remember this: before the fire there was the sun, before the ash there was the vine, and before the silence there was the vibrant, breathing pulse of a city that thought it had all the time in the world. The sun rose over the Bay of Naples on those final mornings with a brilliance that felt like a blessing, unaware that it was a farewell. To look upon Pompeii in the midsummer of 79 AD was to look upon a masterpiece of human order etched into a landscape of wild, volcanic beauty. If Vesuvius was the silent father of the region, Pompeii was its favorite daughter, proud, wealthy, and pulsing with a restless, vibrant energy. To understand what was lost, we must not look at the city as a ruin, but as a living, breathing organism, a place where the stone was warm to the touch and the air was thick with the business of being alive. Imagine yourself standing at the marine gate, the heavy stone entrance that faces the sea. The morning air is crisp, carrying the sharp, salty tang of the Mediterranean and the more grounded, earthy scent of the nearby Sarno River. The city sits upon a prehistoric lava plateau, a natural fortress shaped by eruptions that occurred long before the first Roman footfall. It is a city of layers, a place where history is built upon history, and where the very streets are a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. The pavement under your feet is made of large, polygonal blocks of dark, basalt volcanic stone, forged in the fires of the earth's past, now serving as the humble floor for the feet of thousands. As you walk into the heart of the city, the silence of the morning is broken by the rhythmic sounds of awakening. You hear the heavy thud of wooden shutters being thrown open, the clatter of bronze pots in the kitchens of the great houses, and the distant, melodic calls of the water carriers. This is a world of incredible texture. The walls of the houses are not the dull gray stone we see in ruins today. They are draped in vibrant plaster, painted in shades of deep ochre, brilliant cinnabar red, and a blue so clear it seems to have been stolen from the midday sky. These colors are not merely decorations. They are the skin of the city, a vibrant barrier against the dust and the heat. Let us wander into the Forum, the beating heart of Pompeian public life. Here, the scale of Roman ambition is on full display. Huge colonnades of white marble and flute-carved limestone rise up to meet the sun, creating a forest of stone that offers cool, rhythmic shadows to the merchants and politicians below. In the center of the square stands the Temple of Jupiter, its massive columns reaching toward the heavens, a physical manifestation of the Roman belief in divine order and the permanence of their state. Around the edges of the square, the markets are coming to life. You can smell the sharp, fermented pungency of garum, the fish sauce that was the pride of Pompeii's industry, stored in clay amphorae that lean against one another like tired soldiers. You smell the sweetness of dried figs, the peppery scent of imported spices, and the heavy, yeasty aroma of fresh bread. In the bakeries, the great stone mills are already turning. Imagine the sound, the low grinding rumble of basalt against basalt, a sound that mirrors the hidden movements of the mountain above. The donkeys that turn these mills move in endless circles, their hooves clicking against the stone floor in a hypnotic, unwavering rhythm. The bakers, their skin dusted white with flour like ghosts, pull warm loaves from the beehive-shaped ovens. These loaves are marked with 8 segments, a geometry of sustenance that has remained unchanged for centuries. There is a profound sense of security in this rhythm. When the bread is baked and the wine is poured, when the laws are debated and the gods are thanked, the world feels as though it can never end. But let us move away from the noise of the market and into the quiet sanctuary of a private home, perhaps the house of the faun or the house of the veti. To enter a Pompeian villa is to leave the chaos of the street for a world of curated peace. You pass through the vestibulum and into the atrium, where the roof opens to the sky. In the center lies the impluvium, a shallow pool designed to catch the rain. The water is still and dark, reflecting the clouds as they drift over the mountain. The floors are covered in mosaics, thousands upon thousands of tiny hand-cut stones arranged into images of incredible complexity. You see scenes of Alexander the Great in battle, or perhaps a simple "Beware of the Dog" sign rendered in black and white tiles. There is a stillness here that feels eternal. The Romans did not just inhabit their houses, they lived in a dialogue with them. The walls were painted with second-style frescoes, windows into imaginary landscapes where painted columns looked as real as the ones supporting the roof. They lived in a world of optical illusions, a world where the boundary between the real and the imagined was blurred. They reclined on couches made of fine wood and bronze, eating grapes that grew on the very slopes that would soon betray them. They spoke of the future of marriages, of upcoming elections, of the games in the amphitheater, realizing that their future was a shrinking island. In the gardens, the peristyle courtyards, the air is cooler. Here, the sound of falling water is the constant companion. Fountains, shaped like dolphins or nymphs, spill cool streams into marble basins, a liquid music that masks the dry, warning rustle of the leaves. The plants here are chosen for their fragrance and their beauty: roses, oleanders, lilies, and vines of ivy that cling to the pillars with a desperate green grip. This is a manufactured paradise, a pocket of order carved out of the wild landscape. The Romans were masters of the earth, or so they believed. They had tamed the hills, they had channeled the springs, and they had paved over the fire. But as the day progresses, a strange, subtle tension begins to seep into this paradise. It is not something you can see, but something you feel in the hollow of your chest. The birds in the garden have grown uncharacteristically quiet. The cicadas, which usually provide the soundtrack to the summer, have ceased their metallic buzzing. There is a stillness in the air that feels heavy, like a shroud waiting to be lowered. The slaves in the kitchens and the masters in the tricliniums feel it alike a sense of otherness that they can not quite name. They look to the sky, but it remains a perfect, mocking blue. They look to the mountain, but it remains a silent, green giant. In the great theater, the actors are rehearsing their lines, their voices echoing through the empty stone tiers. The theater is a bowl carved into the hillside, a place where the stories of the gods and the follies of men are played out under the open sky. The masks they wear, the weeping face of tragedy, the grinning face of comedies, stare out at the city with hollow eyes. There is a profound irony in this. While the actors perform their scripted deaths, the city itself is moving toward a finale that no playwright could have envisioned. The theater, built of the very volcanic tufa that the mountain would soon rain down upon it, stands as a monument to human culture, oblivious to the fact that it is about to be cast in stone forever. Let us think for a moment about the people who walk these streets. They are not the ancients we see in textbooks. They are people of flesh and blood, of worry and hope. There is the wealthy matron, her hair intricately braided and held with gold pins, moving through the streets in a litter carried by 4 strong men. She is thinking of the dinner party she will host tonight, the exotic birds she will serve, and the gossip she will share. There is the street merchant, his voice hoarse from shouting, his hands calloused from a lifetime of handling bronze coins. There is the child playing with a spinning top on a side street, their laughter a bright, silver thread in the tapestry of the city's noise. Each of them is the center of their own universe, a universe that is hours away from collapsing into ash. The city of Pompeii was a triumph of the mundane. It was a place where life was celebrated in its most tactile forms. The Romans loved the weight of gold, the smoothness of marble, the heat of the bathhouse, and the bite of cold wine. They were a sensory people, and their city was a sensory feast. Even the graffiti on the walls speaks of this. Humanity scrawled declarations of love, complaints about the price of bread, or simple records of who visited which tavern. "I was here," the walls cry out in 1,000 different hands. They did not know how literally that statement would be taken. As we linger in these final hours of normalcy, let us appreciate the sheer density of existence in Pompeii. It was a city packed tight, a hive of activity where the private and the public were constantly intersecting. The narrow alleys were crowded with shoppers and stray dogs. The balconies hung low over the streets, and the smell of cooking fires drifted through every window. It was a world that felt solid. It felt permanent. The stones were thick, the laws were old, and the gods were honored. But beneath this surface of living stone, the mountain was finishing its long, patient preparation. The 800-year silence was coming to an end. The pressure within the throat of Vesuvius was reaching its breaking point, a tension that had been building since the time of the first kings. The earth was no longer merely shifting, it was straining. In the deep places where no light reaches, the magma was rising, turning the groundwater into steam, fracturing the ancient rock with the force of 1,000 hammers. The city goes about its business. The sun begins to tilt toward the west, casting long, elegant shadows across the forum. The people of Pompeii look at their watches, their sundials, and water clocks and see only the time of day. They do not see the time of the world. They do not see that the clock of their civilization has reached its final hour. We will leave them here for a moment, in the golden light of that last afternoon, suspended in a peace that is as beautiful as it is fragile. For when the mountain finally speaks, it will not speak in words, but in a language of ash and fire that will drown out the voices of men for 1,500 years. The air of Campania, which for centuries had been a balm to the lungs of the weary, began to change in the days leading up to the 24th of August. It was not a sudden shift, but a slow, insidious transformation, a thickening of the atmosphere that seemed to press against the skin with an invisible weight. The sky remained a haunting, perfect blue, yet the light that fell upon the white marble of the temples felt different. It was a flat, brassy light that lacked the sparkle of the Mediterranean morning. To the people of Pompeii, this was merely the dog days of summer, that oppressive heat that makes the blood sluggish and the mind wander. But this was not the heat of the sun alone. It was the heat of the earth rising to meet the sky. Beneath the streets, in the dark and silent veins of the city's water system, the first true warnings were sounding. The great aqueduct, the Aqua Augusta, which stretched across the landscape like a stone artery to bring the cool waters of the mountains to the coastal towns, began to fail. In the bathhouses of Pompeii, the central baths and the Stabian baths, the great lead pipes began to groan. The water that flowed into the marble basins was no longer the clear, refreshing stream the citizens expected. It was warm, carrying a faint, sulphurous temps that whispered of the deep places of the world. Then, one by one, the fountains fell silent. The rhythmic splash of water, which had been the heartbeat of every courtyard and plaza, vanished, replaced by a dry, hollow echoing. The wells, some dug deep into the volcanic tufa, gave up their secrets next. The water levels dropped precipitously, retreating back into the throat of the earth as if the mountain were drinking. When the buckets came up, they were filled with a gray, silty sludge. The wealthy matrons and the slaves at the communal pumps looked at this mud with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. They cursed the engineers. They blamed the drought. They offered coins to Neptune. They did not realize that the magma, rising like a slow tide miles beneath their sandals, was boiling the groundwater, turning the lifeblood of the city into steam. And then there was the silence of the living. It is said that in the days before the sky broke, the animals of Pompeii became the first refugees. On the slopes of Vesuvius, the birds were the first to flee. The forests of oak and chestnut, which had always been alive with the chatter of jays and the song of nightingales, became eerily still. The creatures of the wing took to the air in great, silent flocks, heading south across the bay, leaving the mountain to its own devices. The farmers noticed the absence of the morning chorus, a void in the air that felt like a missing heartbeat. In the city, the dogs, those loyal guardians of the Roman home, began to act with a frantic, inexplicable dread. They did not bark at strangers. They howled at the ground. They paced the courtyards with their tails tucked, their sensitive paws picking up the high-frequency vibrations of rock grinding against rock. Some slipped their collars and fled through the gates, disappearing into the countryside. Those that remained huddled under the heavy oak tables, their eyes wide and reflecting a fear that their masters could not yet name. The cats, too, vanished from the rooftops, slipping into the shadows of the alleys, as if the very air had become toxic to their senses. Even the sea, that vast and seemingly indifferent neighbor, began to show signs of the coming upheaval. Fishermen in the bay reported that the water was strangely warm, and in places it seemed to boil without fire. Great shoals of fish were found dead, floating on the surface like silver coins cast away by a frustrated god. The tide did not retreat and advance with its usual, predictable grace. It twitched, the waterline shuddering against the stone piers of the harbor as the seabed itself was nudged upward by the swelling dome of the volcano. Inside the city, the human inhabitants tried to maintain the fiction of normalcy. This is the nature of the human spirit, to cling to the familiar, even as the ground beneath one's feet begins to tremble. In the villas, the dinner parties continued. Imagine a banquet in the house of the tragic poet. The guests recline on their cushions, the scent of roasted meat and heavy Syrian perfumes filling the room. They discuss the news from Rome, the latest scandals of the Emperor Titus, and the upcoming gladiator matches. But the conversation is brittle. Every few minutes, a subtle tremor shakes the house, not a violent jolt, but a low, rhythmic thrumming that makes the wine in the silver chalices ripple. The guests pause, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second of shared uncertainty before they laugh it off. The earth is just stretching, they say. It is the heat. It is the mountain yawning. This psychological armor, the refusal to see the end, even when it is staring one in the faces, perhaps the most tragic element of the Pompeian story. They were a people of now. Their religion was one of ritual and immediate favor, not of distant prophecies or ecological awareness. They believed that as long as the proper sacrifices were made at the temple of Apollo, as long as the household gods, the Lares, were honored with a bit of incense and a drop of wine, the world would remain in its tracks. They mistook the mountain's long silence for a covenant of safety. As the final night approached, the tremors grew more frequent. They were no longer the gentle nudges of a sleeping giant, but the heavy, deliberate footfalls of something approaching. In the bakeries, the piles of stacked wood for the ovens shifted and slid. In the shops along the Via della Bendanza, the terracotta lamps on the shelves clinked against one another with a metallic, nervous sound. People slept fitfully that night, their dreams troubled by the low-frequency groans that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. Those who lived in the upper stories of the apartment blocks, the insulae, felt the buildings sway ever so slightly, the timber frames creaking like the hull of a ship in a storm. Yet, when the sun rose on the morning of August 24th, it was, to all appearances, just another summer day. The bakers put their bread in the ovens loaves that would never be eaten but would instead be carbonized and preserved for 2 millennia. The laundrymen, the Filones, stepped into their vats of alkaline water to begin the day's cleaning. The bankers opened their chests, and the prostitutes in the lupanar began their shifts. There was a desperate, almost frantic adherence to routine. If they could just keep the city moving, perhaps the mountain would remain a mountain. We must imagine the weight of that final hour. The air was now so still that the smoke from the household altars rose in straight, unwavering lines. The sun was at its zenith, casting no shadows, making the white marble of the Forum almost blinding to look upon. There was no wind. The sea was a sheet of glass. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, caught in that agonizing moment of tension before a bowstring is released. High above the city, Vesuvius stood. It no longer looked green. The dust and the heat had turned its slopes a parched, sickly brown. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but those who looked closely at the summit might have seen a thin, wispy trail of white vapor beginning to leak from the cracks in the crater. It was the first breath of the monster. The plug of rock that had held for 800 years was finally failing. The magma had reached the surface, and it was encountering the last of the groundwater. The result was a physical inevitability, a massive, subterranean steam explosion that would act as the detonator for the apocalypse. To the people below, the first sound was not a roar, but a crack, a sound like the snapping of a giant's bone. It was the sound of the mountain's throat finally bursting open. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible, vacuum-like silence as the pressure was released. And then the sky was gone. A pillar of ash and stone shot into the heavens with a velocity that defied human comprehension. It was not a cloud. It was a solid column of debris propelled by the force of 1,000 suns. It rose 12 miles into the stratosphere, a terrifying dark tower that spread out at the top like the branches of a Mediterranean pine tree. This is the Plinian column, named after the young man who would watch it from across the bay and record its terrible majesty. Imagine being in the Forum at that moment. You look up, expecting to see the sun, and instead you see a wall of darkness rising from the north. The blue of the sky is being swallowed by a bruised, purple-black shadow. The temperature, which had been so stiflingly hot, suddenly drops as the sun is eclipsed. A cold, unnatural wind begins to blow outward from the mountain, carrying the first scent of the end, the smell of burnt stone and ancient Sophysic gas. The first few minutes were not a scene of panic, but of profound, paralyzed awe. People stood in the streets, their tools dropping from their hands, their faces turned toward the mountain. They saw the lightning, not the lightning of a storm, but volcanic lightning, blue and jagged, dancing within the rising ash cloud as the friction of 1 billion stones generated a static charge of incredible power. It was as if the gods themselves were at war within the smoke. This was the transition. The signs had ended, and the silence had been shattered. The world of order, of law, of warm bread and cold wine, was being replaced by a world of elemental chaos. The people of Pompeii were no longer citizens of Rome. They were small, fragile creatures caught in the gears of a geological event that cared nothing for their history or their hopes. As the first pebbles of pumice began to fall light, airy stones that clicked softly against the roofs like the first rain of a storm, the realization finally took hold. This was not a tremor. This was not the mountain yawning. This was the earth reclaiming the city. In the next section, we will follow the first hours of the fall, as the light vanishes and the city of living stone begins its transformation into a city of ash. We will walk with those who stayed and those who fled, feeling the weight of the falling sky as the first day of the end begins. The transition from a sun-drenched afternoon to a world of absolute primordial darkness did not happen with the snap of a finger, but with a creeping, terrifying grace. When the mountain first exhaled its pillar of fire and ash, the people of Pompeii stood in a state of suspended animation. For those first few minutes, the tragedy was a spectacle, a distant roar that felt disconnected from the reality of the streets. But as the Plinian column reached its staggering height of nearly 20 miles, it began to bow under the weight of its own debris and the prevailing winds of the upper atmosphere. The shadow of the mountain began to stretch, not like the soft shadows of a summer evening, but like a heavy, purple bruise spreading across the face of the sky. The first things to fall were not heavy rocks, but bits of white pumice lapilli, the Romans would call them. These were stones born of gas and fire, frozen in midair. They were light, porous, and almost weightless, clicking against the terracotta roof tiles with a sound like the first gentle raindrops of a spring shower. To many, this was a curiosity. Children reached out their hands to catch the white stones, marveling at how a rock could be so light it floated in the garden fountains. But this curiosity was the first trap of the mountain. The lapilli were the scouts of the coming apocalypse, the quiet heralds of a sky that was no longer composed of air but of earth. As the hour progressed, the rain intensified. The soft clicking turned into a relentless, rhythmic drumming. The white stones were joined by darker, heavier fragments, gray pumice, and bits of the mountain's ancient throat that had been pulverized by the explosion. The light of the sun, which had been the certain foundation of every Roman day, began to fail. It did not dim into twilight. It was strangled. The air turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, then a deep, bruised orange, before finally succumbing to a blackness so thick it felt like a physical weight against the eyes. It was a darkness that no lamp could truly pierce, a darkness that seemed to swallow the flame of a torch before it could even cast a shadow. Imagine the interior of a house during these first 2 hours. In the atrium of a wealthy merchant, the impluvium, the pool designed to catch the life-giving rain, is now filling with stone. The rhythmic splash of water has been replaced by the dry, abrasive sound of pumice piling up. The master of the house stands in the center of the room, holding a flickering oil lamp. He looks up through the compluvium, the opening in the roof, but he can no longer see the sky. He sees only a vertical tunnel of falling debris, illuminated briefly by the blue flashes of volcanic lightning that dance miles above. He is faced with a choice that will determine the survival of his bloodline. Does he stay within the safety of these thick stone walls, trusting in the architecture of his ancestors? Or does he flee into the blackness of the streets, where the air is a swirl of grit and the landmarks are vanishing? This was the great dilemma of the first phase. Many chose to stay. They believed in the solidity of Roman mortar. They gathered their families in the inner rooms, the tablinums, and prayed to the Lares, their household gods. They lit incense, the sweet smell of frankincense clashing with the growing, acrid stench of sulfur that was beginning to seep through the cracks in the doors. They did not realize that the mountain was playing a game of physics with them. The pumice was light, yes, but it was falling at a rate of several inches per hour. On the flat roofs of the Pompeian villas, designed to shed water, not stone, the weight was accumulating with a silent, deadly precision. Let us walk for a moment in the streets during this descent into the dark. The Via dell'Abbondanza, usually a river of color and sound, is now a place of nightmares. The ground is already covered in a foot of white stone, making every step a struggle, like walking through a drift of dry, abrasive snow. People move like ghosts, their tunics pulled up over their noses and mouths to filter the fine gray ash that has begun to accompany the stones. The air is hot, not the baking heat of the sun, but a dry, friction-wrought heat that parches the throat and makes every breath a labor. You hear the sounds of a city losing its mind, the frantic whinnying of horses trapped in their stables, the clatter of overturned carts, and the constant, low-frequency rumble of the mountain, which has moved from a crack to a continuous, earth-shaking growl. There is no communal plan, no organized evacuation. Rome had no concept of civil defense for a disaster of this scale. It was every soul for themselves. We see a priest of Isis fleeing his temple, clutching a bag of silver coins and a ceremonial citrum, his white linen robes already stained gray. We see a group of slaves, abandoned by their masters, huddled under a stone archway, their eyes reflecting the terror of a world that has literally turned upside down. The social order of Pompeii, the rigid hierarchy of senator and shopkeeper, master and servant, is beginning to dissolve. In the face of a falling sky, a gold coin is worth less than a sturdy wicker basket used as a makeshift helmet. As the evening of the first day arrived, the situation within the houses became critical. The roofs began to groan. A typical Roman roof was built of heavy timber beams topped with clay tiles. It was strong, but it was not designed to support the weight of several tons of volcanic rock. In house after house, the first sounds of structural failure began: the sharp, gunshot-like crack of a main beam snapping. For those huddled inside, the sanctuary turned into a tomb. The ceilings did not just leak, they exploded inward, raining down hundreds of pounds of stone and timber upon the families below. Many of the bodies found by archaeologists centuries later were not killed by the heat or the gas of the later stages, but by this first, mechanical betrayal of their own homes. Outside, the sea offered no escape. Those who rushed to the harbor found the water in a state of violent agitation. The seabed was rising and falling as the magma chamber beneath the bay shifted. Great waves surged toward the shore, and then retreated with a terrifying velocity, leaving fish flopping in the mud before returning as a wall of water. The ships, the great grain vessels, and the sleek galleys of the Roman navy were being tossed like toys. The air over the water was thick with the same falling stone, and the wind was blowing fiercely toward the land, pushing any vessel that tried to row out back onto the rocks. The great sea, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, had become a hostile, alien territory. In the midst of this, we must think of the young Pliny, watching from Misenum, some 18 miles away. He describes the scene with the detached, crystalline clarity of a scholar, yet even his prose vibrates with awe. He saw his uncle, the elder Pliny, the commander of the fleet, and a man of insatiable scientific curiosity, launch a rescue mission. The elder Pliny did not just want to observe, he wanted to save. He ordered the great quadrimes to be launched, rowing directly into the heart of the darkness. As the ships neared the coast of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the stones falling on the decks became hotter and thicker. The sea suddenly shallowed as the earth buckled. His helmsman urged him to turn back, but the old Roman gave an answer that has echoed through history: fortune favors the brave, but bravery has no currency against a volcano. While the rescue fleet struggled against the elements, the city of Pompeii was being buried alive. By midnight, the streets were no longer streets. They were canyons of white and gray stone. The first stories of the houses were completely submerged. To move from one place to another, one had to climb out of second-story windows and crawl across a shifting, unstable landscape of pumice. The very geography of the city was being erased. The landmarks, the statues of emperors, the fountains of the gods, the signs of the taverns were all disappearing beneath a monochromatic shroud. The psychological toll of this darkness cannot be overstated. For a Roman, the sun was not just a light source. It was a symbol of Apollo, of reason, and of the cosmic order. To have the sun extinguished at midday was to feel that the gods themselves had died, or worse, that they had turned their faces away in disgust. The end of the world was not a metaphor in Pompeii on the night of August 24th. It was a physical reality. People called out the names of their loved ones in the dark, their voices muffled by the ash, receiving no answer but the relentless click-click of the falling stone. Some believed that the giants had escaped their prisons beneath the earth and were now tearing down the heavens. Others simply sat down in the rising drifts, exhausted by the heat and the terror, and waited for the end. And yet the worst was still to come. The rain of stone, as terrible as it was merely the first act of the mountain's performance. It was a slow burial. The stone was cool enough to touch. The air was still breathable if one used a cloth. And the danger was largely mechanical, the weight of the roofs and the difficulty of movement. But deep within the mountain, the internal architecture of the volcano was failing. The massive column of ash, which had stood like a pillar of a dark temple for 12 hours, was becoming unstable. The pressure that had sustained it was dropping, and the sheer mass of millions of tons of rock suspended in the air was becoming too great for the earth to hold. In the small hours of the morning, while the survivors in Pompeii huddled in the ruins of their second floors, and the refugees on the coast looked back at the glowing red summit of the mountain, the Plinian column began to collapse. This was the moment the tragedy shifted from a disaster of stone to a disaster of fire. The ash and gas, instead of rising into the sky, began to spill over the rim of the crater like a boiling liquid. These were the pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and pulverized rock, moving at the speed of a hurricane and carrying the temperature of a furnace. As we end this section, imagine the city as it sat at 2 a.m. It is a silent, lumpy landscape of gray-white stone. The fires that had broken out in the kitchens have been smothered by the pumice. The only light comes from the terrifying rhythmic glow of the mountain's peak, which pulses like a dying heart. The people who are still alive are trapped in the upper reaches of their homes, listening to the silence of a world that has been buried. They think they have survived the worst. They think that if they can just wait for the morning, the sun will return and the rain will stop. They do not know that the morning will bring no sun. They do not know that the mountain is no longer raining stone. It is preparing to breathe fire. The rain of stone was the mountain's way of trapping the city. The fire would be its way of consuming it. We leave the Pompeians here, in the false security of their buried rooms, while the first surge of the mountain's true fury begins its silent, deadly descent toward the gates. The transition from a sun-drenched afternoon to a world of absolute, primordial darkness did not happen with the snap of a finger, but with a creeping, terrifying grace. When the mountain first exhaled its pillar of fire and ash, the people of Pompeii stood in a state of suspended animation. For those first few minutes, the tragedy was a spectacle, a distant roar that felt disconnected from the reality of the streets. But as the Plinian column reached its staggering height of nearly 20 miles, it began to bow under the weight of its own debris and the prevailing winds of the upper atmosphere. The shadow of the mountain began to stretch, not like the soft shadows of a summer evening, but like a heavy, purple bruise spreading across the face of the sky. The first things to fall were not heavy rocks, but bits of white pumice lapilli, the Romans would call them. These were stones born of gas and fire, frozen in midair. They were light, porous, and almost weightless, clicking against the terracotta roof tiles with a sound like the first gentle raindrops of a spring shower. To many, this was a curiosity. Children reached out their hands to catch the white stones, marveling at how a rock could be so light it floated in the garden fountains. But this curiosity was the first trap of the mountain. The lapilli were the scouts of the coming apocalypse, the quiet heralds of a sky that was no longer composed of air but of earth. As the hour progressed, the rain intensified. The soft clicking turned into a relentless, rhythmic drumming. The white stones were joined by darker, heavier fragments, gray pumice, and bits of the mountain's ancient throat that had been pulverized by the explosion. The light of the sun, which had been the certain foundation of every Roman day, began to fail. It did not dim into twilight. It was strangled. The air turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, then a deep, bruised orange, before finally succumbing to a blackness so thick it felt like a physical weight against the eyes. It was a darkness that no lamp could truly pierce, a darkness that seemed to swallow the flame of a torch before it could even cast a shadow. Imagine the interior of a house during these first 2 hours. In the atrium of a wealthy merchant, the impluvium, the pool designed to catch the life-giving rain, is now filling with stone. The rhythmic splash of water has been replaced by the dry, abrasive sound of pumice piling up. The master of the house stands in the center of the room, holding a flickering oil lamp. He looks up through the compluvium, the opening in the roof, but he can no longer see the sky. He sees only a vertical tunnel of falling debris, illuminated briefly by the blue flashes of volcanic lightning that dance miles above. He is faced with a choice that will determine the survival of his bloodline. Does he stay within the safety of these thick stone walls, trusting in the architecture of his ancestors? Or does he flee into the blackness of the streets, where the air is a swirl of grit and the landmarks are vanishing? This was the great dilemma of the first phase. Many chose to stay. They believed in the solidity of Roman mortar. They gathered their families in the inner rooms, the tablinums, and prayed to the Lares, their household gods. They lit incense, the sweet smell of frankincense clashing with the growing, acrid stench of sulfur that was beginning to seep through the cracks in the doors. They did not realize that the mountain was playing a game of physics with them. The pumice was light, yes, but it was falling at a rate of several inches per hour. On the flat roofs of the Pompeian villas, designed to shed water, not stone, the weight was accumulating with a silent, deadly precision. Let us walk for a moment in the streets during this descent into the dark. The Via dell'Abbondanza, usually a river of color and sound, is now a place of nightmares. The ground is already covered in a foot of white stone, making every step a struggle, like walking through a drift of dry, abrasive snow. People move like ghosts, their tunics pulled up over their noses and mouths to filter the fine gray ash that has begun to accompany the stones. The air is hot, not the baking heat of the sun, but a dry, friction-wrought heat that parches the throat and makes every breath a labor. You hear the sounds of a city losing its mind, the frantic whinnying of horses trapped in their stables, the clatter of overturned carts, and the constant, low-frequency rumble of the mountain, which has moved from a crack to a continuous, earth-shaking growl. There is no communal plan, no organized evacuation. Rome had no concept of civil defense for a disaster of this scale. It was every soul for themselves. We see a priest of Isis fleeing his temple, clutching a bag of silver coins and a ceremonial citrum, his white linen robes already stained gray. We see a group of slaves, abandoned by their masters, huddled under a stone archway, their eyes reflecting the terror of a world that has literally turned upside down. The social order of Pompeii, the rigid hierarchy of senator and shopkeeper, master and servant, is beginning to dissolve. In the face of a falling sky, a gold coin is worth less than a sturdy wicker basket used as a makeshift helmet. As the evening of the first day arrived, the situation within the houses became critical. The roofs began to groan. A typical Roman roof was built of heavy timber beams topped with clay tiles. It was strong, but it was not designed to support the weight of several tons of volcanic rock. In house after house, the first sounds of structural failure began, the sharp, gunshot-like crack of a main beam snapping. For those huddled inside, the sanctuary turned into a tomb. The ceilings did not just leak, they exploded inward, raining down hundreds of pounds of stone and timber upon the families below. Many of the bodies found by archaeologists centuries later were not killed by the heat or the gas of the later stages, but by this first, mechanical betrayal of their own homes. Outside, the sea offered no escape. Those who rushed to the harbor found the water in a state of violent agitation. The seabed was rising and falling as the magma chamber beneath the bay shifted. Great waves surged toward the shore, and then retreated with a terrifying velocity, leaving fish flopping in the mud before returning as a wall of water. The ships, the great grain vessels, and the sleek galleys of the Roman navy were being tossed like toys. The air over the water was thick with the same falling stone, and the wind was blowing fiercely toward the land, pushing any vessel that tried to row out back onto the rocks. The great sea, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, had become a hostile, alien territory. In the midst of this, we must think of the young Pliny, watching from Misenum, some 18 miles away. He describes the scene with the detached, crystalline clarity of a scholar, yet even his prose vibrates with awe. He saw his uncle, the elder Pliny, the commander of the fleet, and a man of insatiable scientific curiosity, launch a rescue mission. The elder Pliny did not just want to observe, he wanted to save. He ordered the great quadrimes to be launched, rowing directly into the heart of the darkness. As the ships neared the coast of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the stones falling on the decks became hotter and thicker. the sea suddenly shallowed as the earth buckled. His helmsman urged him to turn back, but the old Roman gave an answer that has echoed through history: fortune favors the brave, but bravery has no currency against a volcano. While the rescue fleet struggled against the elements, the city of Pompeii was being buried alive. By midnight, the streets were no longer streets. They were canyons of white and gray stone. The first stories of the houses were completely submerged. To move from one place to another, one had to climb out of second-story windows and crawl across a shifting, unstable landscape of pumice. The very geography of the city was being erased. The landmarks, the statues of emperors, the fountains of the gods, the signs of the taverns were all disappearing beneath a monochromatic shroud. The psychological toll of this darkness cannot be overstated. For a Roman, the sun was not just a light source. It was a symbol of Apollo, of reason, and of the cosmic order. To have the sun extinguished at midday was to feel that the gods themselves had died, or worse, that they had turned their faces away in disgust. The end of the world was not a metaphor in Pompeii on the night of August 24th. It was a physical reality. People called out the names of their loved ones in the dark, their voices muffled by the ash, receiving no answer but the relentless click-click-click of the falling stone. Some believed that the giants had escaped their prisons beneath the earth and were now tearing down the heavens. Others simply sat down in the rising drifts, exhausted by the heat and the terror, and waited for the end. And yet, the worst was still to come. The rain of stone, as terrible as it was merely the first act of the mountain's performance. It was a slow burial. The stone was cool enough to touch, the air was still breathable if one used a cloth, and the danger was largely mechanical, the weight of the roofs and the difficulty of movement. But deep within the mountain, the internal architecture of the volcano was failing. The massive column of ash, which had stood like a pillar of a dark temple for 12 hours, was becoming unstable. The pressure that had sustained it was dropping, and the sheer mass of millions of tons of rock suspended in the air was becoming too great for the earth to hold. In the small hours of the morning, while the survivors in Pompeii huddled in the ruins of their second floors, and the refugees on the coast looked back at the glowing red summit of the mountain, the Plinian column began to collapse. This was the moment the tragedy shifted from a disaster of stone to a disaster of fire. The ash and gas, instead of rising into the sky, began to spill over the rim of the crater like a boiling liquid. These were the pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and pulverized rock, moving at the speed of a hurricane and carrying the temperature of a furnace. As we end this section, imagine the city as it sat at 2 a.m. It is a silent, lumpy landscape of gray-white stone. The fires that had broken out in the kitchens have been smothered by the pumice. The only light comes from the terrifying rhythmic glow of the mountain's peak, which pulses like a dying heart. The people who are still alive are trapped in the upper reaches of their homes, listening to the silence of a world that has been buried. They think they have survived the worst. They think that if they can just wait for the morning, the sun will return and the rain will stop. They do not know that the morning will bring no sun. They do not know that the mountain is no longer raining stone. It is preparing to breathe fire. The rain of stone was the mountain's way of trapping the city. The fire would be its way of consuming it. We leave the Pompeians here, in the false security of their buried rooms, while the first surge of the mountain's true fury begins its silent, deadly descent toward the gates. When the sun finally managed to pierce the thinning shroud of ash on the morning of August 26th, it did not reveal the world the survivors remembered. The golden Campania, they knew the land of Felix, or happy. Italy had been replaced by a monochromatic landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than a Mediterranean coast. There was no green, there was no blue, there was only a vast undulating sea of gray and white. The hills had been reshaped, the rivers diverted, and the coastline pushed hundreds of yards further into the sea. This was the gray world, a place where the air was still thick with the smell of sulfur, and the ground was still too hot to touch with a bare foot. Imagine being one of the refugees who had made it to the heights of the Sorrento Peninsula. You look back toward where your home, your shop, and your family were just 48 hours ago. You see nothing. Where the bustling city of Pompeii once stood, with its red-tiled roofs and its white marble columns, there is now only a flat, smoking plain. The city has not just been destroyed, it has been deleted. It is as if a giant hand has come down from the heavens and smoothed over the earth, erasing every trace of human endeavor. The silence is the most terrifying part. A city of 50,000 people, which once roared with the sound of carts, laughter, and industry, is now as quiet as a grave. The Emperor Titus, newly ascended to the throne of Rome, faced the first great crisis of his reign. The news reached Rome like a ghost story, whispers of a mountain that had eaten cities. Titus was a man who took the Roman duty of pietas, the devotion to one's country and gods, very seriously. He immediately appointed 2 former consuls to oversee a relief effort. But how do you provide relief to a city that you cannot find? When the Roman rescue parties arrived by sea, they were met by a shoreline they did not recognize. The landmarks were gone. The lighthouse at the mouth of the Sarno was buried. The grand villas of the coast were nothing but lumpy mounds in the ash. The soldiers and engineers of Rome, the same men who had conquered the known world and built roads that stretched to the ends of the earth, stood helpless on the edge of the ash line. They tried to dig, they tried to find the tops of the city walls, but the volcanic material was not like ordinary dirt. It was a mixture of loose, abrasive pumice and a hard, crusty cap of ash that had been dampened by the morning's light rain and then baked by the internal heat of the ground. It was like trying to dig through a desert of warm glass. After days of searching, the reality set in. Pompeii and Herculaneum were no longer cities, they were memories. Let us linger on the psychological weight of this erasure. For the Romans, permanence was a virtue. They built in stone because they believed their civilization was the final stage of human history. To see a city, sophisticated, legal, religious, and commercial center, simply vanish overnight was a blow to the Roman psyche that resonated through their literature and their laws. The poets of the age began to write of the great fire and the final night. They wondered if this was the beginning of the end of the empire itself. If a mountain could swallow a city, could the earth swallow Rome? In the weeks that followed, a few desperate survivors returned to the site. These were the ghost walkers of the gray world. They wandered the ash flats with long poles, trying to find the spots where their roofs might be. Imagine the scene. A father standing on 20 feet of ash, knowing that his wife and children are just a few yards beneath his feet, trapped in a room he can no longer reach. A few managed to dig tunnels of greed or tunnels of grief, breaking through the roofs of their own homes to retrieve a chest of gold, a family heirloom, or the bones of a loved one. You can still see these holes in the ruins today, ragged breaches in the walls, made by people who refuse to let the mountain have the final word. But for most, there was only the long walk away. The refugees from Pompeii, Nuceria, and Stabia flowed toward Neapolis, modern Naples, and Capua. They were the dispossessed. They carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ash in their hair. The Emperor Titus used his own personal wealth to fund the resettlement of these people, but he could not restore what they had lost. He could not restore the feeling of being a Pompeian, the specific traditions of the city, the local cults of the gods, the unique flavor of their wine. All of it was being diluted and lost as the survivors were absorbed into other cities. As the months turned into years, the mountain began its own process of reclamation. The ash, so deadly when it first fell, was incredibly rich in minerals. The first winter rains began to wash the fine dust into the deeper layers of the earth. Incredibly, within only a decade, the first green shoots began to appear on the gray plains. Stunted vines and hardy weeds began to take root in the very material that had killed the city. The mountain was eating the ruins, covering the scars of the eruption with a new layer of life. By the time the Emperor Hadrian visited the region 50 years later, the site of Pompeii was already becoming a myth. People knew a city had been there, but they could no longer point to its center. The Roman state eventually gave up on the recovery of the cities. The cost was too high, the task too monumental. They did something very Roman. They adjusted the maps. They redrew the roads to bypass the dead zone. They moved the boundary markers of the provinces. Pompeii became a no man's land, a place of ghosts and wild dogs. The great basalt roads that once led to the gates were now dead ends, disappearing into the hillside. The name Pompeii began to fade from the official records. It shifted from a place of commerce to a place of legend, a buried city that grandfathers would tell their grandchildren about on long, dark nights. We must think of the long silence that now began. For 1,500 years, the city sat in total darkness. While the Roman Empire fell, while the Middle Ages saw the rise of new kingdoms and the Crusades, while the Renaissance began to bloom in the North, Pompeii remained exactly as it was at 7 a.m. on August 25, 79 A.D. It was a time capsule of unparalleled purity. Beneath the earth, the bread remained in the ovens. The graffiti remained on the walls, frozen in mid-sentence. The bodies of those who had stayed remained in their final poses of prayer or protection. The ash acted as a perfect preservative, sealing out the oxygen and the moisture that would have decayed the wood and the bones. In this gray world, the mountain was the only king. Vesuvius returned to its state of deceptive peace. To the people of the medieval era, it was just a high peak that occasionally puffed smoke. They forgot its history. They built new towns on top of the old ones: Tor, Annunziata, Portici, modern Ercolano. They dug wells and sometimes hit a strange, painted wall or a piece of marble, but they didn't know what it meant. They called the area La Civetta, the city, not because they could see it, but because the local memory still hummed with the vibration of something vast beneath the soil. This section marks the end of the living history of Pompeii and the beginning of its archaeological life. We have seen the city die, and we have seen the world move on, but the story is not over. The gray world is not just a place of death. It is a place of waiting. The mountain thought it had finished the story, but it had only pressed pause. The very act of burial, which felt like the ultimate cruelty to the people of 79 AD, would become the ultimate gift to the people of the future. In the next section, we will begin the journey of rediscovery. We will move through the centuries to the moment when the first shovel hit the first stone and the ghost city began to speak again. We will explore how the city's awakening changed our understanding of the ancient world, and how the gray world slowly gave way to the vibrant, sunlit ruins we walk through today. But for now, let us sit with the silence. Let us imagine the weight of those 15 centuries. The slow, rhythmic ticking of the earth, the roots of the trees reaching down to touch the marble of the forum, and the city like a sleeping beauty waiting for the light to return. The mountain had spoken, and then it had fallen silent. The Romans had mourned, and then they had forgotten. But the stone remembers, the ash remembers, and in the dark, the city was not rotting. It was waiting for its second life to begin. For more than 1,500 years, the city of Pompeii did not exist in the mind of man. It existed only as a ghost in the soil, a dark secret kept by the roots of vines and the foundations of humble farmhouses. The Roman Empire, the very power that had built these streets and enforced these laws, had crumbled into the dust of history. The gods of the forum, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, had been replaced by the cathedrals of a new faith. The language of the city, that sharp and rhythmic Latin, had softened into the musical dialects of Italy. And through all these revolutions of the human spirit, the city remained in its airless tomb, untouched by the sun, the wind, or the passage of time. It was a pocket of the first century preserved in the heart of the 18th. The awakening did not happen with a trumpet blast, but with the dull thud of a shovel. In the late 16th century, an architect named Domenico Fontana was digging a canal to divert the waters of the Sarno River. His workers, cutting through the thick layer of volcanic tufa, struck something hard and smooth. It was a wall, covered in vibrant paintings and mysterious inscriptions. Fontana looked at the Latin words, saw the name of a city, and did nothing. Perhaps he feared the spirits of the dead, or perhaps he was simply a man of his time, more concerned with the flow of water than the flow of history. He covered the paintings back up, reburying the city once more. It was a near miss, a moment where the ghost of Pompeii reached out and was ignored. But the earth is a restless guardian. By the early 1700s, the region was under the rule of the Spanish Bourbons. King Charles III, a monarch with a taste for grandeur and a desire to fill his palaces with the treasures of the past, heard rumors of statues in the soil near the town of Resina. This town, unknowingly, sat directly on top of Herculaneum. A local farmer, digging a well, had struck the marble tiers of the ancient theater. He hadn't found water. He had found the stage where actors had once performed for the elite of Rome. The king sent in his engineers, led by a Spaniard named Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre. Alcubierre was not an archaeologist. The word did not yet exist in the sense we know it today. He was a military engineer, and he treated the buried city like a fortress to be mined. He didn't dig wide open trenches to reveal the beauty of the streets. Instead, he dug narrow, suffocating tunnels into the hard volcanic rock of Herculaneum. Imagine the scene: workers stripped to the waist, lit by the flickering orange light of oil lamps, crawling through tunnels barely wide enough for their shoulders. They were moving through the dark, their picks striking against the very bronze and marble that the pyroclastic surges had encased 17 centuries prior. The finds were spectacular, but the methods were tragic. When the workers found a wall of beautiful frescoes, they didn't preserve the room. They hacked the best paintings out of the plaster and left the rest to crumble in the damp air of the tunnels. They found statues of emperors and goddesses, dragging them out of the mud to be scrubbed and placed in the king's garden. To the people of the 18th century, this wasn't history. It was a harvest. They were looking for curiosities, for gold and silver, for the tangible proof of ancient wealth. They didn't yet realize that the greatest treasure wasn't the gold, but the city itself. In 1748, Alcubierre turned his attention to a site further inland, a place the locals called La Civita. Here, the digging was easier. Instead of the rock-hard mud of Herculaneum, the soil was composed of loose, crumbly pumice and ash. This was Pompeii. On the very first day of digging, they found a wall. On the second, a fresco, but Alcubierre was disappointed. Pompeii was a commercial city, a middle-class town compared to the aristocratic luxury of Herculaneum. The statues were smaller, the jewelry less ostentatious. He almost abandoned the site, unaware that he was standing on the most complete record of human life ever discovered. The turning point came when the ghost city began to show its face. They began to uncover the streets, the dark basalt blocks we spoke of in Section 2, and found them perfectly preserved, even down to the ruts worn by the wheels of Roman chariots. They found the bakeries with the bread still in the ovens, carbonized into black, stony rounds. They found the shops with the jars of wine still leaning against the counters. The world began to take notice. Travelers on the grand tour, the wealthy scholars and artists of Europe, began to flock to the Bay of Naples. They came to see the city of the dead, a place where they could walk through the front doors of a Roman house and feel the shadow of the past. Among these visitors was a man named Johann Joachim Winkel. He is often called the father of modern archaeology, and he was the first to realize the horror of Alcubierre's methods. Winkelmann wrote scathing letters to the scholars of Europe, describing how the excavators were breaking statues and destroying context in their greed for treasure. He argued that the city should be studied, not just looted. He saw that the position of a lamp on a table or the arrangement of a garden told a story more valuable than the gold of a crown. Because of his voice, the awakening began to shift from a treasure hunt into a science. Imagine the atmosphere of those early excavations. It was a world of contrasts. Above ground, the Italian sun shone on the vineyards and the lemon trees, and Vesuvius sat peacefully on the horizon, a plume of white smoke drifting from its peak like a lazy thought. But just a few feet below the surface, a dark, silent world was being peeled back. Each shovelful of ash was like a page being turned in a book that had been sealed for ages. The excavators found skeletons, but they weren't like the skeletons in a churchyard. These were people caught in the act of living or dying. A man clutching a bag of coins near the gate. A woman with her hands over her face. Two people huddled together in a corner. This was the first awakening of the human element. The world began to move beyond the cold marble of statues and toward the warm reality of the people who owned them. In the late 1700s, they uncovered the villa of Diomedes. There, in the cellar, they found the remains of 18 people who had sought shelter from the ash. The impression of a woman's breast was found in the hardened asha, haunting, intimate ghost of a person who had been gone for 2,000 years. This discovery sent a shockwave through the Enlightenment. It was no longer about the Romans as a concept. It was about us. The city was also teaching the world about its own morality. When the excavators uncovered the secret rooms of the city, the Lupana, the brothel, and the erotic paintings in the private houses, the repressed society of the 1700s was scandalized. The King of Naples ordered many of these finds to be locked away in a secret cabinet, accessible only to people of mature age and high morals. The city was too real, too human for the polite society of the time. It showed a world that was vibrant, messy, and unashamed. It showed that the ancients were not just stoic philosophers in white togas, but people who laughed, loved, and scrawled dirty jokes on the walls. As the 1800s began, the scale of the excavation grew. Under the rule of Joachim Murat and his wife Caroline, the sister of Napoleon, the work became more systematic. They cleared the great amphitheater and the forum. They began to see the layout of the city, the way the streets were designed to shed water, the way the public fountains were placed at every intersection, the way the temples dominated the skyline. The city was no longer a collection of holes in the ground. It was a map, but there was still a problem. When the ash was removed, the city began to die a second death. The vibrant colors of the frescoes, which had survived for 15 centuries in the dark, began to fade the moment they hit the light and the air. The wood of the doors began to rot. The rain began to wash away the plaster. The awakening was also a decay. This is the great irony of archaeology. To see the past, we must destroy the protection that kept it safe. The excavators had to learn not just how to dig, but how to save. By the middle of the 19th century, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli took charge of the site. He was a revolutionary, both in politics and in science. He realized that the city shouldn't be cleared house by house, but in a way that preserved the stratigraphy, the layers of history. He also solved the greatest mystery of the Pompeian dead. He noticed that in the compacted ash there were hollow spaces, voids, where something had once been. He realized that these were the shapes of the people themselves. Their bodies had decayed long ago, but the ash had hardened around them, creating a perfect mold of their final moments. Fiorelli began to pour liquid plaster into these voids. When the ash was chipped away, it revealed a cast, a statue made, not of marble, but of the absence of a person. These plaster casts are the most famous images of Pompeii today. They are not art, they are evidence. They show the texture of the clothes, the expression of the face, and the desperate tension of the limbs. When the first cast was revealed, a man lying on his side, his legs pulled up in pain, the first awakening was complete. The city was no longer a myth. The people of Pompeii had returned to the world of the living, not as ghosts, but as witnesses. In this section, we have seen the slow, clumsy process of the world, remembering what it had lost. We have seen the greed of kings give way to the curiosity of scholars. The city, once buried by the mountain's fury, was now being reborn through human patience. But as the streets were cleared and the houses were opened to the sun, a new question arose. Now that we have found them, how do we live with them? The city of Pompeii was no longer a secret, it was a mirror. In the next section, we will explore the golden age of the excavations and the rise of Pompeii mania in the Victorian era. We will see how the city influenced art, literature, and even the way we think about the end of the world. We will walk through the fully revealed forum and the grand villas, looking at the peak of the city's archaeological glory before the challenges of the modern age began to take hold. The silence was over. The city was speaking, and the world was finally ready to listen. By the middle of the 19th century, Pompeii had become more than an archaeological site. It had become a mirror, in which the modern world viewed its own mortality. The Victorian era, with its deep preoccupation with the good death, the romanticism of ruins, and the tension between scientific progress and divine judgment, found its ultimate obsession in the ash-strewn streets of the Campanian coast. The city was no longer just a collection of artifacts for kings. It was a pilgrimage site for the soul. The shadow of the Victorian was one of intense curiosity, where the silence of the ancient world was filled with the clamor of poets, novelists, and the first true tourists. It was during this time that Giuseppe Fiorelli, the superintendent we met in the previous section, revolutionized the way we see the dead. Before Fiorelli, the skeletons found in the ash were merely bones, clinical, detached, and stripped of their humanity. But Fiorelli looked at the earth differently. He understood that the ash was a memorial. When a body had been buried in 79 AD, the fine volcanic dust had packed tightly around the flesh and clothing. Over the centuries, as the organic matter decayed, it left behind a perfect, hollow negative space, a ghost mold of the person as they were in the final second of their life. In 1863, Fiorelli conducted his first experiment with liquid plaster. Imagine the scene: the hot Italian sun beating down on the gray excavation trench, the smell of dust and citrus in the air, and the tense silence of the workmen. They poured the white plaster into a void discovered near the alley of the skeleton. As the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was chipped away with surgical precision, a miracle occurred. It was not a statue, yet it had the grace of art. It was a person. Specifically, it was a man, his face pressed into the ground, his arms bent as if trying to push himself up from a world that had become liquid. The impact of these plaster ghosts on the Victorian imagination cannot be overstated. For the first time, the ancients were not cold marble or distant names in a history book. They had textures. You could see the weave of their woolen tunics, the sandals on their feet, the iron rings on their fingers. You could see the expression of sheer, unadulterated terror on their faces. The Victorians, who were masters of the elaborate funeral and the mourning ritual, were haunted by these figures. They saw in them a frozen moment of judgment. To the religious mind of the 1800s, Pompeii was a second Sodom, a city frozen by God to serve as a warning to a decadent modern world. This fascination gave birth to a new kind of literature. In 1834, Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton published The Last Days of Pompeii. It became one of the most popular novels of the century, a sprawling epic of love, gladiator battles, and divine wrath. It shaped the way millions of people imagined the eruption. Bulwer-Lytton didn't just write about the history, he walked the ruins. He sat in the house of the tragic poet and imagined the characters who might have lived there. He gave the city a narrative. Because of his book, tourists began to arrive in Pompeii, looking not for facts, but for the spot where his fictional characters had died. The city was being rebuilt in the imagination of the public, a phantom city layered over the stone one. As you walk through the ruins, during this golden age of discovery, the atmosphere is one of profound, melancholy beauty. The Victorians loved the contrast of the sublime, the terrifying power of the volcano against the beautiful, the delicate, painted walls of the villas. They would often visit the ruins by moonlight, a popular trend that emphasized the ghostly nature of the site. Imagine the Forum under a full moon, the tall white columns of the Temple of Jupiter, casting long skeletal shadows across the dark basalt pavement. In that silver light, the gap between 79 AD and 1879 AD seemed to vanish. The travelers felt they were walking among the living dead. This was also the era of Pompeii mania in design. The Neo-Pompeian style swept through the dining rooms of London, Paris, and New York. People who had never been to Italy wanted their walls painted in Pompeian red, that deep, earthy cinnabar that had survived the fire. They bought furniture with bronze lion paw feet and oil lamps that mimicked the ones found in the shops of the Via dell'Abbondanza. The city had been excavated, and now its aesthetic was being exported to the homes of the very people who feared its fate. It was a way of taming the disaster, of turning the tragedy into a decoration. But beneath the glamour of the grand tour, the science of the site was becoming more rigorous. The excavators began to realize that Pompeii was not just a city of houses, but a city of systems. They began to clear the great amphitheater, a massive stone bowl that could hold 20,000 spectators. They found the graffiti of the sports fans scrawled insults against the neighboring town of Nuceria, or declarations of love for a specific gladiator. Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh, one wall proclaimed. This was the low history, the history of the common man, which the Victorians found both shocking and endlessly compelling. It was a reminder that for all their togas and temples, the Romans were just like them. The discovery of the lupanar, the city's purpose-built brothel, provided a particular challenge for the Victorian moral code. The walls were covered in explicit paintings, a menu of services. Essentially, for decades, these rooms were kept under lock and key, shown only to gentlemen of high standing after a bribe to the guards. The city was a paradox. It was a site of Christian-like tragedy, but it was also a site of pagan vice. This tension only added to its allure. It was a place where one could contemplate the end of the world, while also peeking behind the curtain of ancient sexuality. Let us consider the House of the Faun, one of the largest and most magnificent residences in the city. When it was fully cleared in the 19th century, it revealed the Alexander mosaic, a masterpiece of millions of tiny stones depicting the battle between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius. To the Victorian eye, this was the pinnacle of ancient art preserved by a miracle. They marveled at the fact that such beauty had been hidden under a field of vines for centuries. They began to see the ash not just as a killer, but as a curator. The mountain had protected the art of the past from the wars and the weather of the Middle Ages. Without Vesuvius, the Alexander mosaic would have been worn away by footsteps or destroyed by invaders. The volcano was the reason the past still had a face. In the late 1800s, the first photographs of Pompeii began to circulate. These early sepia-toned images brought the ruins to those who could not travel. They showed the lonely columns standing against the backdrop of the mountain, the deep ruts in the streets, and the haunting, hollow eyes of the plaster casts. Photography stripped away some of the romanticism of the paintings and replaced it with a stark, undeniable reality. The city wasn't a poem, it was a crime scene. The camera captured the scale of the labor, thousands of tons of earth being moved by hand, the slow peeling back of the shroud. The shadow of the Victorian also brought a sense of urgency. The more of the city they uncovered, the more they realized how fragile it was. The sun, which the Romans had loved, was now an enemy. The ultraviolet light began to bleach the frescoes that had stayed vibrant for 1800 years. The winter frosts began to crack the mortar. The very act of saving the city was starting its second destruction. This led to the birth of conservation, the realization that archaeology isn't just about finding things, but about keeping them. They began to build roofs over the most important houses and install drainage systems to protect the floors. As the century drew to a close, Pompeii had become a part of the global consciousness. It was the eternal city's tragic shadow. It influenced the way the world thought about disasters. The Pompeii moment became a metaphor for any sudden, cataclysmic end. When we look at the Victorian era's relationship with the city, we see the beginning of our own modern obsession with true crime and survival stories. We see the birth of the tourist gaze, the desire to stand in the footprint of history and feel the shiver of the past. We end this section in the year 1900. The city is largely cleared, the Forum is open, and the trains bring thousands of visitors to the gates every week. The mountain remains silent, a brooding presence on the horizon, its last major eruption in 1872, having reminded the world that it is still very much alive. The shadow of the Victorian has turned Pompeii into a museum, a theater of the dead, where the actors are made of plaster and the set is made of stone. But the story of Pompeii's awakening is not yet complete. The 20th century would bring new challenges, wars that would rain fire from the sky once again, and new technologies that would allow us to see through the stone without ever picking up a shovel. The city had been found, it had been romanticized, and now it was time for it to be decoded. In the next section, we will look at Pompeii in the age of modern science, exploring the deep-level forensics and the incredible discoveries that continue to be made even today, beneath the very paths that the Victorians walked. The Victorian era gave Pompeii its soul back, but it was a soul haunted by the tragedy of the end. Now, we move toward a deeper understanding, one where we don't just mourn the dead, but listen to what they have to tell us about the earth, the sky, and the fragile bridge of time that connects us to them. As the 20th century dawned, Pompeii had settled into its role as a global monument, but the world around it was becoming increasingly violent and technologically advanced. For the first time, the city of the dead was no longer just a place of quiet contemplation. It became a survivor of a different kind of fire. To understand Pompeii in the modern era is to understand the city as a modern oracle, a place that we continue to consult, not for prophecies of the gods, but for the hard, cold data of human survival. The century brought with it the realization that the mountain's burial was not the only threat to the past. The very history of the 20th century would leave its own scars upon the ancient stone. The most harrowing chapter of this modern history occurred in 1943, during the height of the Second World War. The Bay of Naples became a strategic battlefield. Allied forces, pushing north through Italy, believed that German troops were using the vast open ruins of Pompeii as a hiding place for ammunition and personnel. In a tragic irony, the city that had been destroyed by the fire of the earth was now targeted by the fire of the sky. Over several nights in August and September, almost exactly on the anniversary of the 79 AD, eruption-allied bombers dropped over 160 high-explosive bombs onto the archaeological site. The destruction was heartbreaking. The Great Museum, which housed many of the finest artifacts found over the previous century, was struck directly. The House of the Faun, where the Alexander mosaic had been found, suffered heavy damage. Walls that had survived the weight of millions of tons of volcanic stone for 1,800 years were toppled in an instant by man-made steel. After the smoke cleared, the excavators found themselves in a strange position. They were now excavating the ruins of a ruin. It was a reminder that the past is never truly safe. It must be defended by every generation. Yet, In the years after the war, the restoration began with a new, modern rigor. This was the era of Amedeo Meucci, a man who dedicated his life to making the stones speak. Meucci moved beyond the grand villas and focused on the total city. He wanted to see how the poor lived, how the slaves worked, and how the infrastructure of the city functioned beneath the surface. Under his leadership, the focus shifted from what was found to how it was lived. But as the century progressed, the tools of the archaeologist changed from the shovel and the pick to the laser and the DNA sequencer. Pompeii became the world's most famous forensic lab. One of the most profound shifts in our understanding came from the study of the microhistory of the eruption. Using modern volcanology, scientists were able to recreate the timeline of the disaster with terrifying precision. They moved beyond the Plinian descriptions of the young Plinian and began to analyze the chemical composition of the ash and the thermal signatures left on the bones of the victims. They discovered that the final surges were not just hot air, but complex density currents that moved with the physics of a fluid. This scientific oracle told us that the residents of Pompeii didn't just die of suffocation. Many died of thermal shock in a fraction of a second, their internal organs failing as the temperature spiked to hundreds of degrees. But the most intimate discoveries were made at the molecular level. In recent decades, bioarchaeologists have begun to analyze the DNA and the isotopes found in the teeth of the plaster casts. This is where the city truly begins to breathe again. We no longer just see a cast of a woman. We see a woman who grew up in the Eastern Mediterranean, perhaps brought to Pompeii as a slave whose diet consisted mainly of grain and fish, and who suffered from a specific dental infection in her final weeks. We can see the invisible Pompeii, the genetic melting pot of the Roman Empire, where people from North Africa, Greece, and Gaul lived side by side. The city is a map of the ancient world's migrations. Imagine the work being done today in the Great Pompeii Project. Instead of clearing massive areas, archaeologists are using ground-penetrating radar to look beneath the unexcavated third of the city, the Regio V. They can see the walls of houses that have not been touched by light in 2,000 years without ever disturbing the protective ash. They are finding fossilized gardens where the roots of ancient trees have left voids just like the human bodies. By pouring resin into these root voids, they can identify the exact species of grapes, olives, and flowers that the Romans grew. They are literally rebuilding the scent of the city. In 2018 and 2019, this modern approach led to some of the most stunning finds in a generation. In a house in Reggio V, they found a fresco of Leda and the swan. The colors so vivid, they looked as though the paint was still wet. But even more significant was a simple charcoal inscription scrawled on a wall. It was a date, 16 days before the calends of November, which corresponds to October 17th. This humble piece of graffiti, likely written by a worker renovating a house, threw the entire history of the eruption into question. For centuries, we believed the city died in August. This modern oracle suggests it actually survived until the cold winds of late autumn theory, supported by the discovery of braziers for heating and the remains of autumn fruits like pomegranates and chestnuts. This is the power of the modern city. It is a place that refuses to be finished. Every time we think we have decoded the story, the stone offers a new riddle. We have moved from the Victorian mourning of the dead to the modern celebration of their data. We look at the House of the Garden and see not just a tragedy, but a botanical record. We look at the Costa Amanti, the house of the chaste lovers, and see the complex economy of a Roman bakery. However, being a modern oracle comes with a heavy burden, the burden of preservation. Today, Pompeii faces a third eruption, not of stone or bombs, but of time and tourism. Millions of feet walk the basalt streets every year, wearing down the stone that survived the volcano. The humidity from the breath of visitors causes the frescoes to flake. The weeds, fueled by the rich volcanic soil, constantly try to tear the walls apart. The modern struggle is a war of attrition. The Italian government and international teams are now using drones and artificial intelligence to monitor the stability of every wall in the city, catching the shudders of the ruins before they collapse. There is something profoundly moving about the way we care for Pompeii today. We are the guardians of a city that was never meant to survive. When we look at the modern excavations, we are seeing the ultimate act of human empathy. We are spending millions of dollars and thousands of hours to understand the lives of people who were, in many ways, very different from us, yet whose final moments resonate with a universal truth. The city is a memento mori for the 21st century. It reminds us that our permanent cities, our London, our New York, our Tokyo, are built on the same shifting earth as Pompeii. As we linger in this modern section, let us consider the cast of the dog. One of the most famous images from the city is a dog found chained in a courtyard, its body twisted in a final, desperate struggle to reach the air. In the 1800s, this was a symbol of cruelty or fate. Today, we look at that same cast and see a biological record of the eruption's force. But we also see a creature that lived a life, that had a name, and that was part of a household. The modern era has allowed us to hold both truths at once, the cold, scientific data and the warm, empathetic narrative. The modern oracle tells us that history is not a straight line, it is a circle. We excavate the past to understand our future. We study the collapse of Pompeian roofs to learn how to build better structures today. We study their diet to understand the history of human health. The city is no longer a graveyard. It is a library where the books are made of ash. As we end this section, the sun is setting over the modern town of Pompeii, which sits just outside the walls of the ruins. The lights of the modern villas flicker on, reflecting in the glass of the museum. Vesuvius is a dark, silent silhouette against the stars. It is still an active volcano, a sleeping giant that will one day speak again. The scientists monitor its every breath with satellites and seismographs, hoping that this time the oracle will give us enough warning to avoid a second tragedy. But for now, the ruins remain. They are a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. They are a place where you can stand in a Roman kitchen and check your watch, realizing that the only thing separating you from the cook who stood there in 79 AD is the thin, fragile veil of time. In the next section, we will step back from the science and the wars to look at the spirit of the city, the myths, the ghosts, and the cultural legacy that Pompeii has left on the human soul. We will explore how the city has become a metaphor for the lost world and why we are still so haunted by its silence. When the sun sets behind the rugged spine of the Sorrento Peninsula and the last of the tourists depart through the marine gate, a different kind of life returns to Pompeii. It is a life not of flesh, but of echoes. To those who spend time in the ruins after the modern world has retreated, the city does not feel empty, it feels crowded. This is the haunted echo, the intangible weight of 50,000 interrupted stories that linger in the air like the scent of ozone after a storm. For centuries, Pompeii has been more than a site of history. It has been a site of the uncanny, a place where the boundary between the then and the now is so thin that it practically vibrates. In the local folklore of the modern towns that surround the mountain Tor, Del Greco, Ercolano, and Boscorial, the ruins have always been a place of caution. Before the great excavations, when the city was still just a series of mounds and strange stone protrusions, the peasants believed the area was haunted by the Ombra di Sinortha, shadows of ash. They told stories of travelers who, taking a shortcut across the Civita at night, would hear the sound of a phantom flute or the rhythmic clicking of invisible sandals on stones that were unthared. These weren't the vengeful ghosts of horror stories, but trapped moment echoes of a city that didn't know it was dead. This sense of being haunted is not merely superstition. It is a psychological reaction to the way Pompeii died. In most ancient ruins, the city dies slowly. It is abandoned, looted, built over, and weathered away. There is a sense of closure. But Pompeii was stopped mid-sentence. The echo is the sound of that unfinished conversation. When you stand in the House of the Faun today, you are not looking at a museum exhibit. You are looking at a crime scene where the chalk outlines are made of stone. This creates a specific kind of spiritual gravity. The city exerts a pull on the human imagination because it represents our greatest fear, the sudden absolute end of the mundane. The 19th and 20th centuries were filled with writers and artists who were claimed by this echo. Think of the French writer Théophile Gautier, who wrote Aria Marcella, a story of a young man who falls in love with a woman's breast print in the museum and is transported back in time to the last night of the city. To Gautier and to many who followed him, Pompeii was a sleeping beauty that could be awakened by the force of human desire. They didn't want to study the Romans. They wanted to be with them. This romantic echo turned the ruins into a stage for the impossible. It suggested that if we just looked hard enough, or felt deeply enough, the ash would fall away and the wine would once again be cold in the jar. This cultural haunting reached a peak in the 1970s, when the band Pink Floyd performed their Live at Pompeii concert in the empty stone bowl of the great amphitheater. There was no audience, only the ghosts of the 20,000 people who once sat there to watch the gladiators. The music, vast, experimental, and atmospheric, echoed off the ancient tufa, bridging the gap between the psychedelic modern world and the elemental power of the volcano. It was an acknowledgement that Pompeii is the silent temple of our civilization. It is where we go when we want to hear the sound of the void. But the echo also has a darker, more personal side. For decades, the administrators of the Pompeii Archaeological Park have received packages in the mail from all over the world. Inside these packages are small pieces of the city, a fragment of white marble, a bit of red plaster, a handful of dark volcanic stone. These are items stolen by tourists as souvenirs, but the letters that accompany them tell a strange, consistent story. The senders claim that from the moment they took the stone, they were plagued by misfortuneless, financial ruin, and a sense of being followed by a heavy, dark energy. They returned the stones with a plea for forgiveness, desperate to sever their connection to the curse of Pompeii. Whether or not one believes in curses, the phenomenon speaks to the spirit of the place. People feel that the city is aware. It is a city that paid a terrible price for its preservation, and it does not like to be picked apart. The stones of Pompeii are not just minerals. They are the witnesses to an apocalypse. To take a piece of the city is to take a piece of that trauma home with you. The haunted echo is a reminder that some places are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be honored. Within the ruins themselves, there are specific places where the echo is loudest. One such place is the Villa of the Mysteries, located just outside the city walls. This grand estate contains a room painted with life-sized figures engaged in what appears to be a secret initiation ritual into the cult of Dionysus. The figures look at you with an intensity that is unnerving. They aren't looking at us from the past. They seem to be looking through time. The silence in that room is different from the silence in the forum. It is a thick, secretive silence, the sound of a mystery that was buried before it could be revealed. People often report feeling a presence in the Villa of the Mysteries, a sense that the ritual is still ongoing, just out of sight in the corners of the eyes. The echo also lives in the names we give things. We call a house the house of the tragic poet, not because we know a poet lived there, but because of a mosaic of an actor found in the floor. We name the streets and the buildings based on our own interpretations, layering a modern Pompeii over the ancient one. The city is a palimpsest, a scroll that has been written on, erased, and written on again. Every visitor who walks through the streets adds their own echo to the city's collective memory. We are all part of the long aftermath. Consider the cast of The Two Lovers. For decades, it was believed to be two women huddled together in their final moments. It was a symbol of female friendship and shared grief. Recent DNA testing revealed they were actually two men, possibly lovers, or perhaps brothers in spirit. The echo changed. The story we told ourselves about those two figures shifted, yet the emotional power of the cast remained the same. The city adapts to our understanding. It provides the raw material of humanity, and we provide the meaning. This is why Pompeii never grows old. It evolves with us. As we move toward the final sections of our journey, let us think about the silence once more. In the Greek myths we spoke of at the beginning, the gods often turned people into stone as a punishment or a transformation. Niobe became a weeping rock. The enemies of Perseus became statues of salt and marble. Pompeii is the real-world version of those myths. An entire civilization was turned to stone, not by a god's whim, but by the earth's necessity. The haunted echo is the sound of those statues trying to breathe. It is the sound of a world that was stopped, but not silenced. When you listen to the wind whistle through the columns of the basilica, you aren't just hearing the weather. You are hearing the same wind that the Roman lawyers heard while they argued their cases. You are hearing the same wind that ruffled the hair of the children playing in the street. The echo is the continuity of the earth. The mountain took the city, but it could not take the feeling of the place. That feeling is what draws us back, generation after generation. We come to Pompeii to see the dead, but we leave feeling more alive, more aware of the precious, fragile nature of our own now. The city is a modern oracle because it tells us that nothing is truly lost. As long as there is a stone to stand on and a story to tell, the people of Pompeii are with us. They are in the haunted echo of the streets, in the golden light of the afternoons, and in the deep dark of the mountain's shadow. We will leave them here for a moment, in this world of whispers and shadows. Before we move into our final chapters, the lessons of the ash and the ultimate legacy of the city that refused to stay buried. As we stand upon the threshold of the final chapters of this journey, we must look beyond the tragedy and the discovery to ask, what does the ash actually teach us? For nearly 2 millennia, the gray shroud of Vesuvius was seen as a blanket of death, a suffocating weight that brought only sorrow. But in the light of modern wisdom, we have come to see the ash as something else, the most perfect librarian the world has ever known. The lessons of the ash are not lessons of destruction, but of preservation. They are the truths that survive when the fire has gone out and the smoke has cleared. They are the quiet, persistent facts of who we were and who we might become. The first and most humbling lesson of the ash is the lesson of universal normalcy. When we study the great monuments of Rome or the pyramids of Egypt, we are looking at the history of the 1%, the kings, the pharaohs, and the conquerors. But Pompeii is the history of the 99%. The ash did not discriminate between the marble palace and the wooden shack. It buried the gold of the senator and the copper coins of the beggar with the same indifferent thoroughness. Because of this, Pompeii is our only true window into the ordinary life of the ancient world. We learn, through the ash, that the ancients were not a distant, alien species. They were a people of habit and hunger. We see this in the carbonized food left on the tables, the eggs that were being cracked for breakfast, the walnuts in a bowl, the fish bones on a plate. These small, mundane artifacts are more powerful than any grand statue. They tell us that the most important parts of the human experience are the things we often forget to write down: the way a kitchen smells, the way a chair feels, the specific spices we use to flavor a meal. The ash teaches us that our normalcy is our greatest treasure, even if we only realize it when it is threatened. But there is a darker, more urgent lesson in the ash, the lesson of climatic fragility. Scientists studying the layers of the eruption have found more than just the history of a volcano. They have found a record of the Earth's temperament. By analyzing the plant life and the soil composition preserved in the ruins, we are learning how the Mediterranean climate has shifted over 20 centuries. We see how the Romans managed their water and their land, and we see how they were utterly unprepared for a geological event of this scale. The ash is a time capsule of the environment, showing us a world before industrialization, a world that felt permanent to its inhabitants but was, in fact, perched on a precarious edge. This leads us to the ethical lesson of the ash, the responsibility to the dead. Pompeii has forced the modern world to confront a difficult question. When does a tragedy become archaeology? When does a person cease to be a victim and start to be an artifact? For centuries, the plaster casts were seen as curiosities, objects to be displayed in glass cases for the wonder of tourists. But today, our perspective has softened. We realize that these figures, the man clutching his keys, the mother holding her child, the dog struggling against its chain, are our ancestors. The lesson of the ash is that we must handle the past with a sense of pietas, that Roman virtue of duty and respect. We no longer just dig Pompeii, we care for it. We have stopped the mass production of plaster casts, preferring instead to use laser scanning and non-invasive technology to study the voids. We have realized that the most respectful way to honor the dead is not to turn them into statues, but to tell their stories with accuracy and empathy. The ash teaches us that every soul, no matter how humble, deserves to have their final moment treated with dignity. Philosophically, the city offers us the lesson of the stillness. In our modern world, we are obsessed with movement, progress, and the next thing, We live in a state of constant, frantic becoming. But Pompeii is a world of pure being. It is a place where time has been arrested. When you walk through the empty streets, you feel the weight of a silence that is not empty, but full. It is the silence of a world that has finished its work. This stillness acts as a mirror. It forces us to slow down, to breathe with the rhythm of the mountain, and to realize that our own frantic movements will one day be just as still. The ash is a teacher of perspective, reminding us that in the grand timeline of the earth, our entire lives are but a single, flickering heartbeat. The ash also teaches us about human resilience. While the city died, the people, or at least, the idea of them endured. The fact that we are still talking about Pompeii today, 2,000 years later, is a testament to the power of the human story to survive even the most absolute catastrophe. The Romans had a concept called fama, the idea that a person lives on as long as their name is spoken. In a strange, twisted way, the mountain gave the people of Pompeii a kind of immortality that no other city possesses. We know the name of the baker Terentius Neo and his wife, not because they were famous in their time, but because the ash preserved their portrait. The mountain took their future, but it gave them an eternal now. From a scientific standpoint, the lessons of the ash are becoming our most valuable defense against the future. Vesuvius is not a museum piece. It is an active volcano with 3 million people living in its current red zone. By studying the way the ash fell in 79 AD, by analyzing the speed and temperature of the pyroclastic surges, we are creating the disaster models that will save lives during the next eruption. The victims of Pompeii are, in a very real sense, the teachers of the modern inhabitants of Naples. Their tragedy provided the data that will allow for a modern evacuation. This is perhaps the most meaningful lesson of all, that the suffering of the past can be transformed into the safety of the future. Let us think also of the social lesson of the ruins. In the streets of Pompeii, we see the remnants of a society that was deeply unequal, yet surprisingly mobile. We see the house of the Veti, owned by 2 former slaves, who became incredibly wealthy wine merchants. Their house is one of the most beautiful in the city, filled with intricate frescoes and bronze statues. The ash shows us that even in a world of kings and emperors, there was room for the underdog to rise. It shows us a society that was vibrant, competitive, and deeply connected. The lesson here is that the human drive for success and beauty is a constant, regardless of the century. As the sun begins to set on our penultimate section, the mountain casts a long, sharp shadow across the ruins. This shadow is a reminder of the lesson of power. Humans are great builders. We pave the earth, we channel the water, we build temples that touch the sky. But the ash reminds us that we are guests on this planet, not its masters. The mountain does not care about our laws, our money, or our borders. It operates on a scale of time and force that makes our greatest empires look like sandcastles. This is not a lesson of despair, but of humility. To live in the shadow of Vesuvius is to live with the awareness that we are part of something much larger and much older than ourselves. The ash has become a medium of connection. It is the bridge between the 1st century and the 26th. When we touch the rough, gray surface of a cast or walk the ruts of the ancient road, we are participating in a conversation that has been ongoing for 2,000 years. The lessons of the ash are ultimately lessons of love, the things we try to save when the world is ending, and the things we leave behind for those who will follow us. In our final section, we will bring our journey to a close. We will look at the ultimate legacy of Pompeii, how it has shaped our art, our films, and our dreams of the ancient world. We will say a final goodbye to the city of stone and fire, leaving it in the quiet care of the mountain. But before we do, let us carry these lessons with us. Let us remember the normalcy, the fragility, the responsibility, and the resilience. For in the end, we are all people of the ash, living in a world that is as beautiful as it is temporary. We have walked the streets of living stone, felt the heat of the falling sky, and witnessed the slow awakening of a city from its 1500-year slumber. Now, as the shadows deepen and our journey comes to its close, we must consider the eternal return of Pompeii. This city is no longer a geographical coordinate on a map of Italy. It has become a coordinate in the human heart. It is the place where we go to remember what it means to be mortal, and yet what it means to endure. The story of Pompeii does not truly end with ash or with discovery. It ends with us, with the way we carry its memory into the future. In the Greek myths we explored long ago, the cosmos was a cycle of birth, destruction, and rebirth. Chaos gave way to order, and order, eventually, returned to the void. Pompeii is the physical manifestation of this ancient rhythm. It is a city that died so that it could live forever. If Vesuvius had never erupted, the city would have been dismantled by the centuries. Its marble would have been burned for lime, its bronze melted down for cannons, and its stories overwritten by the mundane progress of the medieval world. But by destroying the city, the mountain saved it. The eternal return is the paradox of the volcano. The fire was the only thing that could keep the city cold and safe. Think of the spirit of the city as it exists today. It is a place of pilgrimage for millions, but it is also a place of profound solitude. When the crowds leave, the city returns to itself. The wind moves through the empty taverns, rustling the weeds that grow between the cracks in the basalt. The sun sets, casting a golden, nostalgic light over the forum, and for a few moments the air feels heavy with the presence of the past. This is the immortal moment. It is the realization that while the individuals are gone, the form of their life remains. The shape of a street, the curve of an arch, the height of a step, these are the physical echoes of human choices made 2,000 years ago. The legacy of Pompeii has shaped our modern world in ways we often take for granted. It gave birth to the very idea of the past as a place we can visit. Before Pompeii, the ancient world was a collection of texts and legends. After Pompeii, it was a place with texture. It influenced the architecture of our great capitals, the themes of our operas, and the way we tell stories of survival in the face of disaster. Every time we watch a film about the end of the world, or read a book about a lost civilization, we are standing in the shadow of the 79 AD eruption. Pompeii taught us that the world can change in an afternoon, and that realization has become part of our collective DNA. But the eternal return is also about the people. Let us return one last time to the plaster casts, the people of the ash. They are our silent companions. They don't speak, yet they tell us everything we need to know about the human condition. They tell us that in the end, we are all vulnerable. They tell us that love and fear are the two great forces that drive us. We see the father protecting the child, the friends holding hands, the lone traveler clutching his most precious possessions. These are not Roman gestures, they are human gestures. They are the same things we would do if the sky began to fall today. In their stillness, they offer us a profound connection to the lineage of the earth. As we prepare to leave the city, let us look to the mountain one final time. Vesuvius sits there still, a silent, green-clad giant. It is beautiful, it is fertile, and it is deadly. It is the great mother and the great destroyer, all in one. The people who live in its shadow today, the 3 million souls of modern Naples, live with a unique kind of wisdom. They know that life is sweet precisely because it is fragile. They drink the wine grown on the volcanic slopes. They walk the streets under the watchful eye of the crater. And they celebrate the now with a passion that is born of an ancient awareness. They are the living continuation of the Pompeian spirit. The city of Pompeii teaches us that nothing is ever truly lost. It is only waiting to be found. Just as the city waited in the dark for 15 centuries, there are parts of ourselves, our memories, our dreams, our lost loves that are buried beneath the ash of our daily lives. Pompeii invites us to be archaeologists of our own souls. It asks us to dig through the mundane, to find the vibrant frescoes of our own experiences. It reminds us that even when the world seems dark and the sky is heavy with stone, there is a core of us that is unyielding, a part of us that can survive the fire and the silence. Imagine the city now, as the stars begin to appear over the bay. The moon rises, turning the white marble of the Temple of Venus into a shimmering, ethereal silver. The ruts in the road are filled with shadow. The silence is absolute, a deep, resonant peace that feels like a benediction. This is the great sleep of the city. It has done its work. It has survived the eruption, the burial, the discovery, and the wars. It has become a monument to the endurance of the human spirit. It is a place where the clock has stopped, so that we might learn how to value the time we have left. We say goodbye to the baker, his bread forever in the oven. We say goodbye to the children, their laughter forever caught in the stone courtyards. We say goodbye to the priests, the merchants, the slaves, and the matrons. We leave them in the quiet care of the earth, where they will wait for the next generation of travelers to come and find them. They are the guardians of the past, the silent teachers of the lessons of the ash. They do not need our pity. They only need our remembrance. As you drift toward sleep, or as you move back into the noise of your own life, carry the stillness of Pompeii with you. Remember the golden light on the forum. Remember the cool water of the fountains. Remember that you are part of a story that is vast, ancient, and beautiful. The mountain may be powerful, and the ash may be heavy, but the human spirit is a fire that no volcano can truly extinguish. We are the eternal return. We are the ones who remember, the ones who dig, and the ones who tell the story. The city is quiet now. The mountain is at rest. The sky is clear, and the sea is still. Let the weight of the day fall away, like the ash falling onto the streets long ago. Let the silence of the ruins wrap around you like a warm cloak. You are safe. You are part of the history of the world. And in the heart of the ghost city, the light is never truly gone. It is just waiting for the morning. Good night, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the long sleep of the city under the vines. May you find the immortal moment in your own life, and may you always remember the beauty of the world that remains.